Well, I promised to give you some updates on some of my fall chores that I did earlier and how they have turned out. And I want to start, and hopefully, by the way, you're enjoying the white mums. They are in full bloom right now, and I think they look really pretty, and I'll talk about those a little bit more in a moment. But right now, I want to concentrate on this drift rose. It's a Diana drift rose, and you may recall that about a little over a month ago, I cut it way back. It had gotten very overgrown, not unlike this pink one over here. And it was definitely in need of some restoration and reshaping and revitalization. So cutting it back hard really did the trick. Now, I was a little bit concerned because it was starting to show some signs of rose rosette. And I'll put a link below in the description of an article about rose rosette, which is a disease that is now plaguing roses, particularly knockout roses. It's for the most part caused by a virus that's spread by a mite, not like spider mites, so it's very, very difficult to eradicate. But this rose was starting to show some signs of rose rosette. So I wanted to also revitalize it for that reason. It was a risk I was worth taking because typically if you have a rose that is diseased with rose rosette, then you have to remove and discard the rose. But anecdotally, I have found that on some of mine, I can cut out the diseased portions and the rose itself thrives and remains intact, at least for the short term. So that was my thinking behind cutting it back hard. Look at how beautifully it has flushed out. And so far, I have not seen any sign of rose rosette. Now, when I pruned it back with my pruners, I made sure to sterilize them in between each cut. Though even recently, it's one of those kinds of things where information changes all the time. I have read now that that's not necessarily necessary, but better safe than sorry. So far, I see no evidence of the disease. Now, it was very difficult to tell initially because when new growth comes out, it shows the same symptoms of rose rosette. In other words, Stuart, if you can show over here, new growth is often characteristically red tinged, like this right here. And you can also see some new growth in here that is red tinged. Now, a sign of rose rosette is when the branch is deformed, it's very thorny, it can be thick, it gets that characteristic witch's broom at the end, but also it flushes out in that kind of red color. So before I did anything, I just made sure that the new growth that I was seeing was just a flush of red new growth and nothing that was diseased. And it has responded beautifully. I can't believe it. I already have one little white bud on it. So one thing that I'm going to do now, I think maybe every year, is at that time, I would say around the 1st of September, I'm going to start cutting these both back very hard and rejuvenate them. It will prevent black spot, gets this whole area a lot more air circulation. And one thing I also like is it then helps these other surrounding shrubs, the boxwood, this privet, it helps all of them flush out on the side that was kind of being a little bit suffocated by the rose. So I really love that. I've cleaned up all of the diseased leaves. I will throw some mulch on it before it gets too cold, but I really love it. And speaking of cold, it finally feels fallish and kind of Halloween-y around here. So I think everything looks kind of festive and kind of fun. Since the temperatures have cooled and it's not so hot and windy anymore, hopefully these white mums will last a while. Now, my thinking about these white mums was not just because I like that classic look, and I'm not sure that I'll do this many mums again next year, but I did it for a number of reasons, and come this way and I'll show you one of them. And Stuart and I are probably going to be pummeled by acorns as we're walking the front yard because they're falling off of the tree and sometimes squirrels are throwing them at us. Now, come this way, and another reason that I wanted to have white mums in fall is because finally, I say finally, but it's really only been a year, these Encore azaleas that I planted, these are all white bloomers, are really in full bud, and you can see that they're starting to put some gorgeous flowers out. Stuart, can you see that? And I wanted those white mums to really communicate with these white flowers, and I think they look really beautiful, and you can see all these buds that have yet to bloom. And this one, let me see, I don't normally keep tags on, but because I wanted to make sure I knew my varieties, this one is Autumn Moonlight, and it looks beautiful, and you can see that they are really starting to put on height. And as this tree loses its leaves, it will be much brighter down here. They will get much more sun, which will enable them to bloom even more heavily. And you can see I've got some over here now that are all starting to bloom. And I think they will be accented just beautifully with the white mums, and I'm really gonna like this montage. One thing I would say, if I have any one issue, the biggest garden challenge for me is to get plants established. Once they get established, then they will bloom, they will grow, they'll take off. But in Oklahoma, I think that's one of my biggest challenges, is to just get a plant established. Now, I've showed you before. Stuart, would you mind panning around to my tall Eugenia Topiaries that I've got? These I've had for years. They're in faux concrete pots, and actually this week they are going to go to the greenhouse because it's starting to get a little too cold for them. So I've got 3 of them. Now I have this wonky guy over here. This is not a Eugenia, and I basically just saved this. I believe I've shown this to you before, but I saved it so that you can get an idea of what you can do with something that naturalizes in your landscape, planted by the birds or gone to seed, that you can transform into a topiary. And this is just a common privet. Now, if I wanted to keep it as a topiary in my landscape, then I could just prune it into whatever shape I wanted. And you could see that this could easily be transformed into a 1, 2, 3 bald topiary. But I really don't like it back here. It kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. I've kept it here just for demonstration purposes for you guys. But now that I've showed it to you a couple of times, I think it's time for it to go. So I've got these wonderful Centurion pruners that made easy work of it, and I'm taking it down, and it will also, even on the periphery, even a little bit, it will help get more light to these Encore azaleas. And I really like that. Now, one more thing I want to show you, actually a couple more things. Stuart, would you mind going back in here and showing all of the leaves? Now, when I clean up the leafy debris, all of my fallen leaves in my garden, I typically just blow them underneath this holly and around these azaleas. It looks a little bit messy, but nevertheless, it does the trick. It mulches them really well. The oak leaves are slightly acidic, and of course the azaleas like that. But one thing I noticed this year is that sometimes it's difficult. Once the leaves get to be too thick of a layer, it's pretty difficult for rain or moisture to penetrate that leafy debris, and it prevents moisture from getting down to soil level. So I just bought myself a new toy. I'm so excited. Stuart talks about his new video toys, and I talk about my new garden toys. And I just bought myself, and I'll put a link below, a leaf mulcher, an electric leaf mulcher. I think this one is by Worx, and it converts 9 or 10 bags of leaves down to 1, but it shreds them into much finer texture. So what I'm going to do is just mulch all of these leaves, then put them them back in place. It will protect them. It will ultimately feed them, but more importantly, it will not create a barrier that prevents penetration of moisture down into the azaleas. This whole area is a little bit messy right now, but you can't see it. Can't really see it from the street, so I'm not worried about it too much. So Stuart's nodding his head for me to come over this way. And I want to show you one more thing. So I talked about, hello. I talked about all of these white mums, and you'll ask me what will I do with them when I'm finished. Well, here's what I'm going to do with them. So come this way. In a video last week, I talked about saving these really, really large pots. Well, this one I have filled up halfway full with just debris from my compost pile, thrown some dirt in here, and once those mums are done, I'll cut them back and I'm just going to plant them in moss in here. And then next year, I will have in early spring a huge white pot of bloomers, and again in the fall. So I think that's going to be kind of fun. I might even try planting some bulbs in here to see if they'll come up through the mum foliage. I kind of like to experiment like that. So those are just a few things that I've got going on my previous fall checklist and update, and some other things I'm going to be doing in the next 3 or 4 weeks just before tulip bulb planting time.